There's a battery sitting in a patent filed over 120 years ago that costs about $5 to build, lasts longer than most marriages, and was quietly shelved not because it failed, but because it worked too well. Let me say that again. A battery that doesn't die isn't good for the battery business. Right now, the average person replaces their car battery every 3 to 5 years. Multiply that by 40 years of driving, and you've spent hundreds of dollars just to stay at the same starting point. And home energy storage. Companies sell you wall-mounted battery systems for $12,000 with a 10-year warranty, which, if you think about it, is just a polite way of telling you it'll stop working in year 11. We've all accepted this cycle without questioning it. New battery, charge, drain, die, repeat. But what if that cycle was never actually necessary? Here's where it gets interesting. In the late 1800s, Thomas Edison wasn't just obsessed with light bulbs. He was trying to build a practical electric vehicle, something that could compete with the gasoline engine. And the thing standing in his way every single time was the lead-acid battery. It corroded, it died in cold weather, it lost capacity after a few hundred charge cycles. Edison reportedly called it one of the most deceptive technologies ever sold to the public. So he set out to replace it entirely. What followed was one of the most relentless research efforts in the history of engineering. Edison ran somewhere between 50 and 60,000 individual experiments. Not guesses, actual documented lab trials, testing cobalt, copper oxide, silver, zinc, cadmium, and dozens of other combinations, before settling on two metals that kept outperforming everything else, nickel and iron, soaked in a solution of potassium hydroxide. The nickel-iron alkaline storage battery, filed as United States patent number 678-722 on July 31st, 1901, better known today as the Edison cell. And what came out of those experiments was genuinely strange by the standards of everything we know about batteries. The Edison cell couldn't be killed in the normal ways. You could short-circuit it, freeze it, drain it completely flat, and leave it sitting for months, overcharge it. It would come back the moment current hit the plates again. There are documented sets of original Edison cells manufactured before World War I that were still holding a charge decades later. A set installed at a railroad signal station in 1912 was reportedly still operational past the year 2000. That's not a typo, so why don't we all have one of these in our garage? The chemistry behind it is surprisingly simple once you understand it. In a lead-acid battery, every charge cycle leaves behind a small amount of crystallized sulfate on the plates. You can't remove it. It just builds up, taking up space, blocking the active material. After 500 cycles, sometimes less, you've lost half your capacity and you're shopping for a replacement. But in an Edison cell, the electrolyte is potassium hydroxide, an alkaline solution, and it doesn't form those crystals. The chemical reactions at the plates are completely reversible. The iron and nickel compounds that form during discharge dissolve completely when you push current back through. Nothing accumulates, nothing degrades. The plates essentially reset themselves every single cycle. That's the science, and it's real. It's not folk wisdom or garage mythology. It's documented electrochemistry that any university library will confirm. Here's the industry side of things, and this is where the story gets a bit uncomfortable. By the time Edison's company began folding into larger conglomerates after his death in 1931, the battery division landed in the hands of organizations far more invested in the petroleum economy than in long-lasting home energy storage. There's documented correspondence between executives in the post-war era explicitly discussing limiting nickel-iron technology to industrial markets, mining locomotives, signal stations, submarine applications, and keeping it away from the residential consumer market. Not because it was unsafe, not because something better had come along, because a battery you buy once in your lifetime doesn't generate quarterly revenue. Production of the Edison cell in the United States ended in 1972. The equipment was sold off. The patents, long expired by then, slipped into public domain obscurity, and the knowledge of how to build one quietly faded out of mainstream circulation, except in the places where nobody was paying attention. In communities across rural Ohio and Pennsylvania, certain workshops kept running on battery banks that looked nothing like anything sold in a modern hardware store. Heavy, glass-cased, sitting on wooden shelves, inherited from fathers and grandfathers, some of them built in the 1950s and 60s, still holding a charge, still doing their job decades later. The people using them called them Edison cells. They didn't make a big deal out of it. They just worked. If you want to build one yourself, here's what you actually need. 4 wide-mouth glass jars, quart or half-gallon size. Nickel sheet, real nickel, not nickel-plated, from a metal supplier, cut into roughly 3 by 5 inch rectangles. Cold rolled iron sheet from a hardware store, same size. Potassium hydroxide flakes, sold as drain cleaner or lye at farm supply stores, 90% purity or better. Distilled water, never tap, never spring. And here's the detail that most modern reproductions miss entirely. Lithium hydroxide, available from any chemistry supplier, about 50 grams per liter of electrolyte solution. Edison himself identified this addition in his lab notebooks in 1903. Without it, the iron plate slowly degrades over time. With it, the plate chemistry stabilizes and the lifespan triples. This was documented clearly in Edison's original notes, but it got dropped from every popular write-up after the 1950s. And builders who skipped it wondered why their cells only lasted a decade instead of 4. To assemble a cell, cut 3 nickel plates and 3 iron plates per jar. Alternate them and separate them with strips of fiberglass mesh or non-conductive plastic screen. Connect the nickel plates to one copper wire terminal, the iron plates to another. Mix your electrolyte, 210 grams of potassium hydroxide per liter of distilled water, then add 50 grams of lithium hydroxide per liter. Do this in a glass or stainless container, never aluminum. Wear gloves and eye protection. Work in a ventilated space. Potassium hydroxide is caustic and the mixing reaction generates real heat. Let it cool completely before pouring. Fill each jar until the plates are submerged with about an inch of liquid above them. Cap the jars loosely. You want gas to escape during charging. Wire all 4 jars in series. And do you have a bank producing around 5 volts? Charge it from any 12-volt DC source. A small solar panel, a car charger run through a resistor, a wind generator. The cells accept charge at almost any rate. For the first charge, go slow. Edison's specification called for a 48-hour initial formation charge at low current to distribute the active material evenly across the plate surfaces. Skip that and the cell will still work, but it won't hit full capacity for the first several cycles. A few honest limitations worth knowing. Edison cells run at about 65% charge-discharge efficiency compared to roughly 95% for lithium-ion. In a grid-tied system where you're paying per kilowatt hour, that gap matters. In an off-grid system powered by solar or wind, what matters is total lifetime output, and a 65 efficient battery running for a century delivers far more usable energy than a 95 efficient one that needs replacing every decade. The math isn't subtle. They also off-gas small amounts of hydrogen during charging, which sounds alarming until you realize lead-acid batteries do the same thing in larger volumes. A cracked window or a small vent tube to the outside handles it completely, and they're heavy. The energy density is far below lithium, which is why this technology never came back for electric vehicles or consumer electronics. But for a stationary bank sitting in your basement or your shed, weight is irrelevant. What matters is whether it works when the grid goes down, whether it survives a hard freeze, whether it's still holding charge 30 years from now when the sealed lithium system you bought last spring is already 3 replacements in the past. The chemistry is documented, verifiable, and reproducible by anyone willing to spend a weekend in the garage. What was lost wasn't the technology. It was the habit of asking whether the thing being sold to you is actually the best option available, or just the most profitable one for someone else. At Hidden Fix Lab, that's the question we keep coming back to. Not because the answer is always dramatic, but because asking it consistently is the difference between being a customer forever and actually understanding how things work. Build the 4-cell bank. See what 60-year-old engineering feels like when it's sitting on your workbench, holding a charge.